It's the 9th of August, 1845. The Swedish corvette Carlskrona is set to depart from its home port, which the ship happened to be named after, the port city of Carlskrona, Sweden. In command was Erik Gustaf af Klint, an experienced officer. He is on a diplomatic mission for the Swedish monarchy, first to North Africa and then the Americas. He gives the order to raise anchor and prepare to leave the harbor. Soon there is a commotion. The captain has discovered the anchor has slipped from its lashing before it could be secured and plunged back into the water, taking 2 of the crew with it. But only one of the men is able to be rescued in time. Before even leaving the harbor, the Carlskrona has already lost one of its 130 crew. Only 17 would ever see home again. The unlucky voyage of the Carlskrona, today on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask for you, my loyal listeners, to please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you don't use either of those apps, you can head on over to goodpods.com or podchaser.com and leave a review there. As an independent podcaster and a one-man operation, it would really help spread the word and make the show easier for others to discover. I would sincerely appreciate it. Thank you so much. This episode features a largely unknown story of the Swedish ship Carlskrona. There is very little information about the ship and almost nothing written in English. I was fortunate enough to connect with author and amateur historian Jens Kuhn, who knows quite a bit about this particular ship and its history, and you'll hear from Jens throughout this episode. The Carlskrona was a Swedish corvette, built in 1841 at the shipyards in Carlskrona, Sweden. She was 113 feet long, had a beam of just under 31 feet, and a draft of 14 feet at the stern, with capacity for 130 crew. As a corvette, speed was more important than size or firepower, and she was built according to her intended purpose. Here's Jens Kuhn.
A lot of people who are into boats will know that a corvette is like an escort ship in the Second World War, like the Flower-class corvette. But in the age of sail, in the English-speaking world, they weren't called that. They were called sloops of war in the Royal Navy. And the corvette, or the sloop of war, is the smallest full-rigged, three-masted vessel in the hierarchy of sailing fighting ships. So anything below that is technically not a ship. It's a brig or schooner, whatever. They are a little bit smaller than frigates, but they have pretty much the same function. So they are often away on missions on their own, scouting, escort duty, finding enemy ships, engaging them if they are small enough, and alerting the fleet if they're not. So they would be on signaling duty in big battles, repeating signals to the big ships of the line. They would be able to deal with privateers, for example, quite efficiently. After the Napoleonic Wars, they were used to hunt slavers. The armament normally would be about 18 24-pounder guns. A frigate normally would have anything between 20, 24. I think they in the end up having more than 40. But you wouldn't be part of the line of battle. That's the main big difference. What makes a corvette different from a frigate in construction terms, and which might have a bearing to what happened to Carlskrona, is that there is no weather deck on top of the gun deck. That had the advantage that the crew normally lived quite comfortably, because on most warships at the time, crews lived in hammocks that were hung up between the guns. In a corvette, you actually have a proper deck that's empty, where you can have crew space and storage and stuff. But the fact that there's nothing on top of the gun deck obviously means it's more exposed, and whether it has an effect on the stability of the ship once it's in a position where it shouldn't be, which is on her beam ends with the masts in the water. So there is a lot of theory about the guns having played a role in the fate of the Carlskrona.
The ship was designed by a British naval architect, William Simmons, who did design a number of warships, but he was much better known to be a designer of racing yachts. The Carlskrona was designed with these principles in mind.
Now, what the designers of Carlskrona did, they put the big sails on it, but they didn't put that much ballast at the bottom. So she has been compared to a racing yacht that has lost her lead keel. Now, this sounds like, oh, that was a bit stupid to do, but actually it wasn't. You wanted a corvette to be faster than any other ship that had heavier guns than what she carried herself. So you needed a lot of sail area, and you needed a relatively sleek and not too heavy hull. The stability problem was assumed to be okay in a warship where you had a large crew to handle the sails. It's the same as a racing yacht, really. They do not need to be that stable because you have a lot of people to take sails down quickly and manage the sails and adapt the sails when the wind changes. And on a warship, it's the same. You have hundreds of people you can send up. You can get the sails down very quickly. It's not a merchant ship where you have like 14 people to do it all. So there was a compromise between speed and stability that people were aware of at the time.
On this specific voyage, the Carlskrona carried more guns than usual, as it was delivering a shipment of cannon to the Swedish colony of St. Barthélemy in the Caribbean. Stowed in the hold below, these added some extra ballast to the ship.
The guns on this ship had a slightly more modern carriage than is normally imagined. If you think of a sailing gunship or sailing warship, you will have these wooden four-wheeled gun carriages that you see in the movies. The carriages are metal, so these guns are heavier than they normally would be, which is also interesting because in the end of the day, a lot of this what happened comes down to weight distribution.
In command of the Carlskrona was Erik Gustaf af Klint. He was a seasoned veteran of the Navy and an experienced sailor.
He was born in 1801, the oldest of 14, and he entered the Royal War Academy, if I translate it, in 1813. So he was 12 years old at the time. And at age 16, he had the rank of sub-lieutenant. Basically, you can go to sea, you can stand a watch, but you are the bottom of the pecking order in the wardroom. He had some part in missions where some royals were moved from Germany to Stockholm. Probably gave him some credit in his later career. He then, between 1821-ish and 1825, he actually left the Navy and became an officer on merchant ships for a while. He also took part in his father's business at the time. His father was actually a retired admiral, so it's a Navy family. And after his retirement, the father started a publishing house for nautical literature or nautical textbooks. So they produced a lot of the material that was used to teach officers of the Navy. They also produced printed nautical charts. So he was really considered one of the most experienced captains at that time.
The first officer of the Carlskrona was Frederick August Teschmaden. The Teschmaden family was a prominent and high-standing family among the Swedish nobility. Frederick entered the Royal Naval Academy in 1820 at the age of 15 during a time of peace. Sweden's last participation in a war was in 1809 during the Finnish War against Russia. That conflict resulted in Sweden losing the territory of Finland to Russia, as Finland had been a province of Sweden before this time. Following the disastrous result, Sweden pulled back its military force, remaining neutral in European conflicts, at least officially.
All these Navy people in the 1820s, they didn't really have that much warring or Navy things to do. And I suppose that's partly why all these old naval families with admirals, they start printing charts, and the people, they still send their kids to the Naval Academy because that's what you do, but they can't all end up on warships because there aren't that many. So they go into the merchant navy, or, as our Fredrik August does, into foreign service. Another interesting thing about this that I just need to mention, I was contacted by a Mr. Tashmedan, who is an ancient relative of this very first officer. And he had done a little bit of research about his family, and he sent me a little bit of information about this. He goes to France and enters the French Navy, where he actually goes to war. Now, it's quite interesting with Swedish nobility being in French service. That is a bit of a tradition. There is one Axel von Fersen, who is very well known, who also entered French service and fought in the War of 1776, the American Independence War. He also was supposed to be the lover of Marie Antoinette. So he does this, and he takes part of the invasion of Algiers on board of a ship of the line, the French ship of the line Breslau. So that ship was part of a landing operation during this war. And I'm quite sure our lieutenant here was part of this, because he was actually given the highest French military order. After that, he got a medal for it, Légion d'honneur. They don't give that to anyone. So he's rather experienced in the field as well, we can say. He comes back and goes back into the Swedish Navy and becomes first officer on the Carlskrona.
As you heard in the opening of this episode, the Carlskrona departed on its fateful journey on the 9th of August, 1845. But there was immediately a problem with the anchor. It had slipped its locking mechanism while being raised and gotten stuck.
The first thing that happens when they leave harbor is that they get the anchor stuck. So when they're pulling up the anchor, the procedure entails 2 people of the crew, 2 seamen, to secure it. And for some reason, I am not an expert in this practice, and I have not seen it, read about it done this way, but in the Swedish Navy, apparently that was how it was done. That entailed someone actually climbing down and standing on it and put some sort of rope around it. And that went wrong. So 2 people fell in the water, and only one of them would be recovered alive. So they're down to 128, only minutes out of the harbor. No, and it gets worse, because before they even are out of sight of the coast of Sweden, they run aground. Now, to their excuse, I will say that I do not know any sailor in Swedish waters who hasn't ever run aground. I have run aground at least a few times. The Swedish coast is littered with shallow rocks and tiny islands, and some of them are just a little bit below the water. And most of the time, nothing really seriously happens. You go at low speed, you slide up a little bit on the very slippery rock, and what you do is you tell all your crew to run aft, put as much weight as possible at the back of the ship, and it will just slide off again. And that's exactly what happened to Carlskrona as well. It's what they did. And they sent the carpenter down to check if there were any leaks. There weren't any, and they just carried on. That was normal procedure. There wouldn't be a court-martial if you run aground in the Swedish Navy in the 19th century. I suppose that would probably not be the same in the Royal Navy, but it's how it's done in the Baltic. So they sail on, and their first stop is on the 30th of August in France, in Brest.
The stop in Brest was uneventful and brief, and the Carlskrona was again soon underway.
The next stop on the trip is in Tangiers, in North Africa, Morocco, where the captain has his first actual mission, which is also an interesting one with a little bit of history, because what he is supposed to do there is to sign a treaty with the ruler there, not sure if he's a sultan or what he is, which is supposed to end payments from the Swedish government to stop the Sultan attack Swedish shipping. So this is another thing that ties in with what happened in the 1820s and 1830s, because up to the Napoleonic Wars, it was quite common for the North African kingdoms, or what you want to call them, to conduct acts of piracy in the Mediterranean, and sometimes even up into the Atlantic and up to the British Isles, taking ships, taking sailors for slaves, and taking them back to North Africa and sell them or use them as they felt fit. And a lot of countries in Europe paid these people money to exempt their own subjects. It's protection money. And the Swedish crown did this until after 1815. There was obviously a lot of navy around that was no longer needed. Napoleon was gone. There was peace in Europe. But all these navies had a lot of, particularly the Royal Navy, and had a lot of ships, and they needed to do something with them. So they actually started to patrol the areas, put stop to piracy, and af Klint goes there as the missionary of the Swedish king and makes this Sultan sign the treaty, and that goes well. It doesn't have to bombard the town or anything, thank God. I don't know how that would have gone. With the Swedish Navy not having fired a gun since 1809. But the next mission he has is actually in Argentina. So he sails there via Gibraltar, Tenerife, and arrives in Montevideo on the 25th of November, 1845. Now, what he has to do there is a possibly even more tricky mission. But at that time, there was an Argentinian confederation, some sort of independence movement back in the days there. So they did have a government which wasn't recognized by a lot of countries at the time. And they were actually at war with France and Great Britain. So the Royal Navy and the French Navy had ships down there to blockade the harbor. And our captain af Klint with his little corvette sails right through it, wafting the Swedish flag. We're neutral, not been at war since 1809. Let us through. And that goes well. They did let him through. Not sure if the French are aware that they have a member of their Honorable Legion on board. Maybe that would have helped. Maybe they knew. And they have a nice time in the harbor. They anchor up. There is a little bit of complaints about the facilities and how difficult it is to get ashore with boats and the surf and all kind of things. But they stay and have basically a little holiday. There is stories about being invited to people's homes for meals and, all these kind of things that sailors do when they have shore leave. They also take the opportunity to make some repairs to the ship. After all, they just crossed the Atlantic. They provision the ship. The 10th of January 1846 now, that they leave Montevideo for the next leg of the trip. They do a little stop in Rio de Janeiro. From the 22nd of January to the 4th of February, they are having another shore leave in Brazil.
While anchored at Rio de Janeiro for shore leave, the Carlskrona had a chance encounter with the USS frigate Raritan. The Raritan was known as one of the fastest American ships, and its officers were in the habit of placing bets, wagering no other warship could outsail her. But the USS Raritan had not come across a ship such as the Carlskrona. Remember, it was inspired by racing yachts and was extremely fast. The officers on the Raritan lost their bets that day, as the Carlskrona did indeed outsail the Raritan, to the delight of the Swedish sailors. Setting out on the 4th of February, 1846, the Carlskrona's next stop was the small island of St. Bartholomew, which was a Swedish colony at the time, and it arrived there on the 2nd of March.
Most of the stuff that they brought with them for their own colony was offloaded. And among these things, there was a lot of weapons. There were muskets and there were guns or gun carriages that were offloaded there. At the same time, they then provisioned the ship for the trip back to Sweden, but only for the expected number of weeks. Normally, they would provision a ship like that for about 5 months and assume that that's what we do, because we never know what happens. We might get orders to do something else. We might get stuck. There might be a storm. But now they were just supposed to go home.
The Carlskrona departed St. Bartholomew on the 2nd of April before stopping at Havana, Cuba for 6 more days, where they stock up again on supplies. On the 30th of April, Erik Gustaf af Klint and the Carlskrona leave Havana, destined for Sweden.
Even though it doesn't look like it, the weather is nice, everybody's happy. The crew is actually doing washing, drying washing on the deck and everything. The whole day, the winds are relatively moderate. It's all fine until it gets to the evening, just before 6 o'clock. The captain orders a first reef to be taken in. It is standard procedure in sailing warships, maybe all sailing ships, maybe merchant ships do that too, is to have the sails reefed at night. So before darkness, you would take a reef into the sails, just because it's trickier to do sailing maneuvers in the dark. It's trickier to see approaching storms in the dark. So to be safe rather than sorry, a reef is normally taken in. They are taking the reef in, and they then send half of the crew, a bit more than half of the crew, down below and sort of try to start to settle in for the night. Now, there is a discussion happening between the first officer, our Fredrik August Tersmeden, and Captain af Klint about some sort of change in the weather. There's something on the horizon they're not quite sure about. And the captain says, I don't think there is going to be much of a gust. And the first lieutenant looks, waits. He seems to agree first, but then he says, well, some wind, I think, is in there. And then suddenly, this is now from the witness statement that we have from Fredrik August, the first officer. He says, suddenly a thunderous sound could be heard. And this is a bit unclear now what happened here. From the statements, different statements about what happened. There are some actions taken. Even before orders are given, the crew is letting sheets fly, which means that you try to take the wind out of the sails. And the captain orders the top gallants, mainsail and mizzen to be taken in, and the helm to be put up in order for the ship to fall off the wind. Now, this is another thing. Now we're getting a little bit technical on the sailing parts of things. So people who are familiar with sailing boats, such as me, who sail like yachts and dinghies and small boats, the normal procedure when you encounter a gust of wind is to head up into it. So you sail closer to the wind, because if you have the wind right in front of you, you have no power. The boat normally stops. Now, on a square-rigged sailing ship, that doesn't work. It's actually the opposite effect. If you go with square sails straight against on top of the wind, they will backfill. So you will have the wind from the front, and you will completely lose control of the ship. So the standing order Captain af Klint has ordered is to never point up to take a gust. Instead, you fall off the wind and try to take the wind as far from behind as possible. That is also standard procedure in sailing big square-rigged ships. That is what all navies would do. If you have a storm, you run away from it. If you have the sea room, you take the wind behind you. Now, he's trying to do that, but none of these orders given about taking in the sails and bearing away from the wind are carried out in time. It's a huge, massive gust of wind hits the ship and heels her completely over onto a beam ends, meaning the yards where the sails are on are in the water. The boat is completely lying flat on its side. That is a death sentence for a lot of big sailing ships. So we will be talking about stability, but there's no guarantee that a more stable design would necessarily be able to recover from this. If there's enough ballast and if the ship is watertight, there might be a chance. Now we have some other things that disfavor the design of our corvette. First of all, there is no upper deck. So the water is straight on the gun deck. The lower guns are in the water, and there is also no additional layer protecting the hatches. So there are hatches in several places in the ship, 3 or 4 hatches where you go down into the ship from the deck, and these hatches were open. They weren't secured for storm. There was no pre-warning, and they wouldn't normally be closed because the watch needs to be able to come up and down. So water poured in, and once that happens, there is definitely no way out. If the hatches would have been closed, if the gun ports are tight, if there's no ballast shifting, and the sails were released, maybe you could come back up. But in this case, there was absolutely nothing they could do. And it only took 3 minutes for the ship to sink.
What the Carlskrona may have experienced was a white squall. This violent windstorm comes on quickly, with little or no warning, and it lacks the dark storm clouds that normally accompany a storm. The only warning of a white squall are the whitecaps and broken waves on the surface of the water. White squalls are not terribly common at sea, although they are more common in the Great Lakes and sometimes in the Caribbean. White squalls can even develop into a microburst, producing a tremendous amount of downward energy on a small area. The Carlskrona went down just a short time after leaving Havana, about 8 nautical miles off the coast of Matanzas, Cuba, in the Florida Strait. The Carlskrona did suffer from instability in exchange for its speed. The only chance it had was for the crew to act very quickly, but they were not able to act quickly enough. Those on the upper deck went into the water, and some were able to swim away from the sinking ship. Those below deck had no chance. All went down with the ship. This included Captain Eric Gustav of Klint.
The defense against the deliberate instability in order to gain more speed for this type of ship is that you have a large number of people who can do things very quickly when things go wrong, but they can't do it that quickly. They can't do it within a minute, which would have really been needed to do here. But our first officer and 8 other people, I believe, found themselves floating around and found one of the ship's boats that also has floated off. Now, you could possibly question yourself why that happened, because that should really have been secured down somehow. But anyway, it managed to float up. So they cling to that, and they also find another 9 people floating around, which they managed to rescue. This is almost a little bit a Titanic-like situation, but in warm water. As a lot of sailors used to say that there's only 2 ways it can go for you that when you end up in the water. Either you freeze to death, or you get eaten by sharks. Now, what happened here was they didn't freeze to death. So quite a few got eaten by sharks. So Terschmeden and his survivors really struggled to get this one boat they have bailed out so it would float and they would be safe from the sharks and stand a chance. Several attempts are made, and eventually they actually manage to get the water level inside the boat lower than outside. And as someone who has capsized in sailing dinghies with no self-bailing capabilities several times, I can tell you that is hard work, particularly if there is any sea on and it gets just filled up again. They get picked up by an American merchant ship, and one of the first conversations that the first lieutenant here, Terschmeden, has with the captain of the ship, he obviously asks him, have you encountered any storm? Because obviously, how did you get through? Terschmeden says, oh, your rigging is rather loose. He observes that this American merchant ship's rigging looks a bit out of shape, and being a Navy officer, he can't obviously stop himself from criticizing that. But the captain immediately says, this on purpose. We do this here because if we get hit by a squall, we lose the rigging, but not the ship. So the idea here is, if the storm hits, the mast will just go overboard, but the ship won't capsize.
In total, only 17 survived the wreck, including First Officer Terschmeden. Eventually, the survivors made it back to Sweden. As is customary with any navy, there was an investigation into the wreck and a court-martial. Terschmeden provided a lengthy witness statement, as did other survivors, and all of it went into the official record. However, rumors and speculation began to spread among the newspapers, with journalists taking cheap shots and laying accusations as to who was at fault. One of the rumors stated the guns on board were not secured and shifted during the rough storm, causing the Carlskrona to heel over to one side. According to witness statements, only 2 of the guns came loose and did not cause any problems with the stability of the ship. Another rumor described a sailor on board who claims he told the captain of the coming storm and its dangers. However, during the court-martial proceedings, the sailor denied ever saying such a thing. According to him, he never saw a storm and never spoke to any superior officer about it.
It is a rather modern situation, actually. We would have that with the Titanic, we would have that with any shipwreck today, that people would start to speculate. And at the same time, there is a lot of rallying around this as a national event as well. So we need to remember this is the biggest maritime disaster in the Swedish Navy in peacetime, probably since the Vasa. I mean, there were ships lost during the war, but that doesn't count. If you get sunk by the enemy, that's one thing. But if you just falter in a storm, that's a different thing. So there were collections for the survivors. There was a concert held where people paid to attend, and the money would go to the widows and all these kind of things. So there was a lot of things happening around it. But the court-martial in the end concluded. Well, one thing that I found interesting was one quote from the court-martial was that they refrained from putting any blame on Captain Arthur Clint due to the fact that he was dead. So we cannot say anything about he done right or wrong because he's dead anyway. But the first officer testmate, and he does get acquitted. He is not blamed for anything, and neither is any other of the crew.
Although nobody was blamed for the sinking of the Carlskrona, one important change resulted from the court-martial. Starting in 1847, the same year that the court-martial proclaimed its final verdict, the Swedish Navy started to introduce healing tests for newly built vessels. The Carlskrona proved to be a costly, but ultimately valuable lesson for the Swedish Navy. The story of the Carlskrona is almost entirely unknown. The information discussed throughout this episode is taken from a 1945 book published only in Swedish, titled Corvetten Carlskronas Systeres by O.R. Sylvan.
One thing that is concluding this little book that I based all this on is that the person who's written it is actually a naval expert. He did quite a lot of stability calculations in the end. He was applying more modern calculations about the stability of the ship. It's a quite elaborate calculation, which I, again, do not have the engineering knowledge to follow in detail, but he goes into, it's like wind pressure per square meter of sail and all these kind of things. If the wind speed would have been 33 meters per second, that is about 66 knots of wind speed. There would be a pressure of 420 metric tons on the rigging, and there would just simply have been no way to recover that.
Although the story of the Carlskrona is not well known, by telling and retelling the story, as far as we can understand it, the events, survivors, and those who were lost will not be forgotten. I'd like to thank Jens Kuhn for joining me as my guest for this episode and for bringing the story of the Carlskrona to my attention. Jens has written several books, including the novel Gunboat No. 14, available on Amazon, and you can follow Jens on Twitter and Instagram. Links can be found on this episode's show notes at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, produced, and edited by me, Rich Napolitano. You can follow the show on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at ShipwrecksPod, and on Mastodon at shipwreckspod@c, that's the letter C, .im. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him on YouTube at Sean Secret or visit his website at sean.siegfried.se. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode, and until then, remember, wear your life jackets.